Welcome to Pax Britannica, the English Revolution Q&A with David Crowther, Part 2.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. I know you're exhausted by the Q&A, and I had to tell you I'm exhausted too. I do want to say, while he's out of the room, that it's mainly Sam's fault. Does talk a lot, doesn't he? Anyway.
What was that, David?
Hello. Sam, hi. Welcome back. We were just talking.
Sorry, I just stepped out of the room. Well, you were going on and on and on, so I stepped out to have a cup of tea and walk the dog, and I was like, he'll still be going. I ran a few errands.
So rude. So, welcome back, everybody. Obviously, we had a lot of questions, which was fantastic. We really love it, and we've enjoyed answering them way too much. And so we split it up, and so this is your next segment.
Lisa is by the standing system because she says, I listen to both of your podcasts religiously. Well done. How important is it to understand Charles and Cromwell as actors? In other words, is there anything to the great man theory as applied to this moment? Answer that question first.
I think that, like I said earlier, Charles is king. That he is central to all of this. And if he'd sincerely compromised, then he probably could have got away with certainly his life and maybe even his crown. I think, there's no getting away from the fact that he is the man at the center of everything that's going on during the trial. And his actions could have changed everything. So in that sense, he is a great man in that thing. Cromwell, I don't think, has as much autonomy outside of that. He is, yes, very influential, but he is having to appease certain factions within the army, within Parliament. He has much less room to maneuver. And in a sense, once the trial begins, he doesn't have the freedom of movement that Charles necessarily would. So I think, he's not as powerful an actor in that moment.
I agree with you that Charles is particularly influential, and in that sense, Lisa, yes, the great man theory does apply. Because also people have tried to impose, great big trends on the civil wars. So, famously Christopher Hill with his Marxist interpretation of the rise of the middle class, the rise of the gentry, Lawrence Stone, the decline of the aristocracy, that sort of thing. Religious things about hangover from the Elizabethan settlement. None of them have worked. And what everybody comes back to is that this is a quarrel which Charles fails to resolve. We should have done. Second part of the question, was there any plausible alternative to what actually happened, meaning alternative to regicide and republic?
Yes, like I said earlier, I think that if Charles had sincerely compromised, like he appeared to do at Newport, I think that if he had acknowledged the authority of the court, that would have been enough of a win that would itself have shown he was willing to compromise. And then maybe a death sentence wasn't the only way out of that. By refusing to plead, he was sticking to his guns and communicating to everyone involved, I'm not shifting, you're going to have to kill me. Oh, David, what's happening on your end? Jerry Richmond asks, at the beginning of the Long Parliament in late 1640, who would an objective Englishman say had the better constitutional argument, Charles I or John Pym?
Nobody knew what the answer was. Both of that. I mean, I think one of the fascinating things about the English Civil War is how close their description of the ancient constitution is on both sides. Crazy. It's really just a matter of emphasis. I think Tim Harris makes the point that a lot of people agreed with Charles that he had an absolute right to do what he wanted. Far more than we think of now. So I don't think there's an answer to that, Jerry, because I don't think there is an objective answer. I don't think there is a right or wrong here. It's a question of interpretation and emphasis.
David Lane asks, was Cromwell's protectorate an inevitable result of the abolition of the monarchy and the execution of Charles I? What do you think, David?
I think, Sam, it's far too hard a question because it's a definite what if, isn't it? I think nothing was inevitable. I think the rump fails to concentrate really hard on creating an ethos around who they were and why you should support them rather than the monarchy. And in that failure lies the problem, because I don't think someone necessarily wanted to. He just loses his rag. But
no, I completely agree. I think that Charles isn't executed and then Cromwell declares himself protector. You've got 4 years of rump rule, during which the rump fails to address grievances that are very near and dear to the army, and does nothing to win popular support for itself. And even after that, the army gets rid of the rump, but brings in bare bones parliament, which is meant to be a placeholder to set up another representative government. And then they fail to address certain grievances, and they start piling on more grievances. So then the army steps in. It's only after that Lambert presents Cromwell with the instrument of government, and Cromwell rejects the idea of being king and accepts the lesser title of Lord Protector. So I do not think it is inevitable whatsoever. I think that if the rump had been better at its job, I think the Protectorate wouldn't have happened.
In essence, Sam, the rumpers of the rump caused too much rumpy-pumping.
Yeah, that would sum it up nicely. Bill Cook says, "I've always wondered how religion on the one hand and loyalty to local landowners on the other dictated the allegiance of a village during the Civil War." And he says that parts of his village were owned by the Earls of Northampton, others were owned by a Catholic family, and others were owned by Eton College. So it was largely royalist, but largely parliamentarian by religious inclination.
It is very interesting. I did an episode on reasons for allegiances, and it's really complicated. And basically, people after Christopher Hill had these, theories about the rise of the middle class and all the rest of it. People went away and they did all these country studies, and what they found was it depends. In some places, the landlords were really strong and powerful, and everybody followed their lord. In other places, like the West Riding of Yorkshire, the wall towns were really strong. The reasons for allegiances were many and various. David Underdown's lovely chalk and cheese proposition. It's absolutely incredibly varied, incredibly diverse, and very much often down to local circumstance. I've always wondered about is why Oliver Cromwell dithered so much over accepting the crown in 1657, which is a really interesting question. I don't know who Finbar was. So Finbar's basic point is, why did he dither? Because we normally ask, why did he not accept the role of king? But actually Finbar's quite right in asking, well, why did he even think about it? What do you think?
Well, first I have to say I haven't reached it yet. I'm slightly ahead of you, David, but only by a few years, and I've only just reached the Protectorate. But at this point, he's already been offered the crown. Lambert already offers him the crown, and when Cromwell firmly says no, he has to rush back and redraft the instrument of government to take out any reference to monarchy, and instead you get the Lord Protectorate.
The thing I thought was particularly interesting was the meeting with the Army Council in December 1651, where he calls a meeting to talk about the rump having an election and what the style of government should be. And he says that he favours, and I quote, a constitution with a monarchical element. I think he believes in the idea of having a single person who has, can arbitrate between the different powers, which is what Lambert gives him eventually. He doesn't think it should be called king because king, as you said, has been ruled on by God. But apart from that, he actually likes the idea of a monarchical element, and I think that's why he talks about being. Also, the politics of the period. His civilian supporters desperately wanted him to take king. His army desperately didn't want to take him. So it's a difficult political situation.
I think it's really interesting, David, that you bring up that army meeting, because I actually recently read an article by Jonathan Fitzgibbons, which basically talks about how we're not actually sure when that meeting took place.
Oh, right.
And it's because Whitlock says, it takes place during the Republic. And Fitzgibbons argues that, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Because he's right. He's telling this after the Restoration. He's trying to make himself out to be this, trustworthy figure. And he actually suggests that meeting took place before Charles was executed.
Interesting.
And it was about whether to place Henry on the throne so that they don't have a republic in between. They just swap out kings.
Oh.
And I think that's a really interesting point of view, because it really, that opens up the whole question of, okay, did Cromwell want to be king at all? Because the evidence is quite thin on the ground.
That's another interesting point that raises, just how difficult it is to decode much of what happened in the Civil War, given that most people are writing it after the Restoration and are essentially trying to knit an arse cover.
Oh, absolutely. And Whitlock is first among them, because him and Monk do not get on, and Monk has just restored the king. So he is doing his best to make himself out to be like, oh no, I was never in favor of killing your dad. No. I was fighting Cromwell every step of the way. And it's a very interesting analysis of his writings that Fitzgibbons does, that it's like, yeah, well, of course he would say this, because he's actually writing to try and save his life, because he might get executed.
You want to ask a question from Michelle of this parish?
Of the famous Michelle Gersich, who is a long-time listener of both of our podcasts, I believe. She says, I asked this on the History of England Facebook page, so I don't feel obliged to go over it again. Well, too late, Michelle, we're going to. I was curious, though, to get Sam's ideas on why Parliament became so independent-minded in the 17th century, when it seems pretty docile during the Tudors. What societal changes influenced the shift, or was it all due to Charles's personality? Should I answer that? I suppose I might as well.
Yes, this is all to you. I should have asked.
This is all to me.
It's all down to you. I've already tried and clearly failed, Michelle.
No, I don't. I don't think so. And if you did fail, then she's going to be equally disappointed with me, because I think we agree on the same points. I think a major thing is the failure of the Great Contract to modernize the finances of the English state. That's at the heart of a lot of the trouble that James certainly has with his parliaments, because parliaments are very, very stingy and they don't realise how good they've got it. You've also got to bring in the Stuarts are coming from the Scottish parliamentary system, where they can essentially browbeat Parliament into doing what they want. That does not work in England. They try and run roughshod over the English Parliament, and it annoys them. You've also got a shifting of the demographics of MPs. You've got a lot more lawyers nowadays, and they love to debate detail. They love to go into the archives and bring up constitutional precedents and rally around Magna Carta. And then, of course, you've got the weaponization of Parliament by Prince Charles against his dad, which is a massive own goal, and his dad even warns him against it. And finally, it's, particularly under Charles as king, it's the collapse of the religious balance. It's no longer safely put to one side. It's now an issue of incredible relevance to everyday life, and what is earthly precedent and the honor of kings when you're talking about your immortal soul. I think it's a combination of many different factors, and then you get a very belligerent parliament that is ramped up after decades to actually, take on the king.
Excellent. Far better than obviously I did. I think also the looseness of James's court, I think, is more of an issue than we sometimes think it is, because the court no longer is the frontal virtue. People lose, and Parliament becomes the thing that people look to as their leader rather than the court.
Hello, this is Editing Sam popping in with a few extra points. Me and David were discussing this question afterwards, and we realised we'd missed out two things we wanted to add to the answer. And the first is that the Elizabethan parliaments and the early Stuart parliaments were very well managed, with people like the Cecils. Once Robert Cecil dies in 1612, James doesn't really have another manager who can come in and keep parliaments under control, and Charles never really does. In fact, the closest he gets is people like Strafford, who completely misjudge how far they can push Parliament. And the other factor was the growth of popular politics, which is hand in hand with the growth of the printing press and print culture. This wasn't new to the Stuarts, but it had been steadily growing. There was more awareness of politics, more engagement with politics. Parliaments were now under much more scrutiny. There was much more attention given to their deliberations. That's it. Back to the questions. Jarrow asks, did the much earlier rebellion of Simon de Montfort, 6th Earl of Leicester, influence the Long Parliament and its armies in any way? He also asks, how comparable is the rebellion of Simon de Montfort with the First English Civil War? Cast your mind back to the early episodes of the History of England podcast.
Absolutely, it's a lovely question. I went and picked out my book on Simon de Montfort. It's a lovely question. I wish I could answer that, yes, everybody looked to the Father of Parliaments and said, hey, this is what we should be doing. But I definitely did. I'd never seen any reference to it. I mean, obviously, the fact that they existed in Parliament is due to some degree to Simon de Montfort, but I don't think they refer specifically to Magna Carta as a thing that is really in everybody's minds. And, Edward Cook is a bit clever about that. I don't think they're very comparable, although John Adamson might disagree. So basically, the Earl of Leicester is a baronial revolt against the king, essentially a bit like Magna Carta comes from. But it does sweep up these other things because he talks about the community of the realm, and the community of the realm is absolutely a concept that gets caught up again with the Commonwealth, and the Rumpers think of themselves as Commonwealth's men. So in that, there is some similarity in the concept of ideas, the community of a realm, but it's much more of a baronial revolt, whereas in this English Civil War, the thing that's fascinating about it is a much more popular element. Lawrence asked a great question, essentially saying, look, since the internet has these days disrupted our politics with a sort of post-truth vibe, could the same be said of the widespread literacy in printing presses, which meant that if this had happened in medieval times, the Stuarts would have far less of a problem than they had in this more modern, sophisticated world? What do you think, Samuel?
I think that's absolutely the case. I think the printing press is one of those major developments for a reason. Mass literacy, mass exchange of ideas plays such an important role all across Europe and then the wider world that absolutely I think it does lead to a much greater breakdown of the status quo, and especially after the breakdown of censorship, because then you get really crazy ideas that would normally be stopped and the authors punished. But even before that, you've got the Netherlands presses, which are constantly sending English political tracts across the channel to cause trouble. So yes, I think Lawrence is on the money there, that the exchange of ideas, free or not so much free, really does, it's fuel on the fire of everything else that's going on. Tim Foster asks 2 questions. First, throughout the Stuart period, civil wars and the settling of the Americas, East Anglia seems to be a hugely important place in terms of political power, strong puritanism/godliness, and an eagerness to colonize the New World. How did this particular combination of traits come about? Was East Anglia special, or were there plenty of other places like it? And then his second question is a bit more fun. He asks if David's indignant posho voice is modelled on anyone in particular.
I really don't know what you mean, and I'm outraged. The question should be asked at all. East Anglia is lovely. Yeah, I love East Anglia, and I love its whole history, and it really is special. Tim's absolutely right. It's got this. I think the key to it is godliness. It's one of the earliest to get behind the Reformation. It's one of the earliest to turn Christian, I think, in the way back when. But I think there's probably a better answer, Tim, which if I had time, I could look into and research as to why godliness is so much, the Puritan thing does so much stronger in East Anglia, and of course leads the transportation to the New World, the translation of both attitudes to New England rather than the West Country, which leads to Virginia and all the rest of it. So it's a great question. I think there is something special about it. I put it down to godliness. Why they're more godly, as it were, more Puritan, I do not know. And I think there's a great dissertation to be written.
Something I did come across when I was looking at that question is that a lot of refugees from the Netherlands and from France who were they were Calvinists or they were Protestant of one flavour or another, they settled in East Anglia, and quite a large minority. So that might be part of the route. But like I agree, it deserves a really detailed answer that I don't know enough about.
Are there English Civil War reenactments similar to the American ones? And are certain areas of the UK more likely to have royalists or parliamentary reenactors?
That is a great question. The one that immediately comes to mind is the Sealed Knot group, or Sealed Knot Society, I think, named after a royalist conspiracy during Cromwell's protectorship. They, I think, do reenactments. There's also a lot of stuff around, I think, the Huntington Library, Oliver Cromwell's old seat, that they also do a lot of things. They have a lot of events around this kind of stuff. But in terms of more areas more likely to be royalist or parliamentarian reenactments, I'm not sure. There are some people who still insist that Charles I did nothing wrong. So presumably they'll be firmly in the royalist camp of the reenactments. But I don't know. I don't think it's regionalized like that. And I suppose you can't really have a fake battle unless you've got two fake sides.
Excellent. So, actually, I don't know about the distribution one either. Lord Grey's regiment I came across when I took the old trout to Basing Castle. We had a nice time there. And I find the reenact is really difficult because I want to have a chat about, what they know about Civil War and what's this and that, and they won't come out of character. Fantastic. The Civil War Society as well, I think, run lots of reenactments. Loads of them are completely bark me mad. I was reading Paul Lay's book, Sovereign's Lost, and he talks about the Sealed Knot. He says, and I quote, this is me, not from me, Sealed Knot. This is not my words, this is Paul Lay's quote. The Sealed Knot is today a group of harmless obsessives. That's Paul Lay's reenactors. This is from Edward, actually, who's active on the Facebook site and asks lots of good questions. Do you think Cromwell's religious toleration truly included Catholics? ? To what extent was he an outlier in this amongst the Puritans?
Edward, that is a great question. I actually think that it did. I think Cromwell was a independent in the broadest possible sense. And that kind of makes sense because Puritans who are firmly independent and want no barriers between man and God, that logic can apply to Catholicism and Catholic rights. They might despise the Pope or the Catholic ecclesiarchy, but their whole, point of being is that, we don't believe that anyone should be told how to worship God. So that, in a sense, should include Catholics. And there are points where Cromwell shows this and puts this into practice. There's a very interesting point just before the Second English Civil War, where Cromwell and Ireton appear to have been considering toleration for Catholics in the heads of proposals, but both the House of Commons and the Pope oppose it. Then when Cromwell opens Barebones' Parliament, he's not Lord Protector, he's just, the most powerful man in England, but makes a speech, it's very long. Central to it is his insistence that religious toleration be central to their deliberations. And he appears to include Catholicism. He doesn't rule that out. He says something along the lines of, be nice to the most poor, misguided Christian lamb, which presumably includes Catholics. One of his major problems with Barebones' Parliament is that they're not doing that. They are being very strict uniformists. He doesn't like that. There are multiple times during his Lord Protectorship where he intervenes personally to protect Catholics who are, besides being Catholics, they're law-abiding, and he steps in to make sure they're not being persecuted. And, that's very difficult to square with his actions, especially in Ireland, but also in England during the Civil Wars. There are cases in England where he does lead massacres of Catholic clergy, Catholic households, and in Ireland, well, all of that happens. But at the same time, even in Ireland, he draws a line between ordinary Catholics who have just been they've been misled, they've been led astray, and Catholic clergy who he despises and transports or kills or whatever. So I think, he's very complicated and very complex. And when it comes to Catholicism, he does have space in his mind to say, I know they're wrong, but they deserve to continue to be wrong because they are still Christian. His problem comes from, when it overlaps with political power, with clergy and the Pope and treason. That's when he gets annoyed. So I think it's a very, very complicated question. I gave a very broad and vague answer, but I hope that does answer it.
I think it was an excellent answer. I think it's one of the most difficult things looking at Cromwell now in the current age. I very often people saying, "Oh, Cromwell's a bigot," whereas in actual fact, it was a good deal less of a bigot than anything else. But the bar is very high for a bigotry, as it were, whatever the right way around is. So great answer. I think John Morrill recently, in his letters of Cromwell, blah blah blah, says there's quite a lot of evidence. There's a famous letter to Mazarin where he talks about, I'd really want to give them toleration, but it's really hard at the moment.
Lawrence asks, many of the families that rose on the back of the land grab that took place with the dissolution of the monasteries were Catholic and remained so. Was Protestantism then in some way the way that the new mercantile and labouring classes could belittle and reduce the power of these snooty overlords? In short, not so much religious conviction fueled the conflict for many, but more a feeling that they could stick it to the man. That's a great question. David, do you have any thoughts?
I think the answer is no. I think one of the things we find a little bit difficult, or I find it a bit difficult to get my head around, is just how much religion meant to people in those days and how seriously they took it all. So I think that these religious affiliations are genuine and religious concerns are genuine. There is kind of of course, there's Weber's thing about, the Protestant work ethic and, views of what Protestantism meant, the idea of that individual relationship with God, whether that meant you were less hierarchical. So there might be something in that. But in general, I would say actually these were not class-based. But it may be that the rise of the middle class that Jonathan Healy talks about makes them more able to question. Also, reversely, I suspect you can criticise me on this, that till the migration to Britain around the time of the Great Hunger and so on, I tend to think that Catholicism became an aristocratic preserve because only they could afford the fines and, they liked the hierarchy and the grandeur. But anyway, that's only a theory.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me.
Dwight asks a long and very interesting question, I think, which comes down to what is the difference between Arminianism and Calvinism and why was it so important? And this can relate to the thing about what the difference between all the sects were. So as far as I understand it, Calvinist, direct relationship with God, no altar rails, for example. The priest was a minister, a helper, didn't have any red telephone to God or anything any different from any ordinary person. So the altar rail things is all because it's putting gaps up, putting blocks up between you and the priest, making the priest special, which I don't believe it is. Only biblical authority, salvation by predestination, and no icons. Rough Calvinism. Arminians, beauty of holiness, sanctity of the priest, formality, images and representation, salvation by grace and good works. So Arminianism looked a little bit like Catholicism. That is an offence against the Calvinists who believe that the Pope is the Antichrist. I don't just mean that's not just a casual insult. He is the Antichrist trying to drag us all to hell. So the differences are doctrinal. The differences are presentational. They are, in the end, they are about the immortal soul. You can either burn or play harps. So it is incredibly important that as far as Calvinists said, Arminianism looked like Catholicism and was going to drag them to hell.
So the question we are going to start on, I'll start off asking you, shall I, Sam? This is from Rick, who is from New England, Maine, to be exact. So he feels the shared history coming from Maine, I suppose you have, with this period. And in the US, we learn that this is the labour pains period of the American nation. How closely connected, asked Rick, how closely connected were my ancestors here in America to their brethren in England? And why here do we treat this period with such reverence? Oh, and on the end, he said, P.S., I adore both of your podcasts. Thank you, Rick. We adore you too now.
Thank you, Rick. Well, great questions, Rick. Unfortunately, I'm not sure about the reverence aspect of that. I think that is a question for an American historian. But in terms of how connected the American colonies were with England, quite connected. They were as well connected as the distance and the weather allowed them to be. There's the Great Migration during Charles's personal rule, but then as soon as the civil wars kick off, a lot of those people, nowhere near enough to damage the long-term stability of the colony, but still a substantial amount of New England colonists go home and fight or serve in Parliament or become officials or just go and try and sway people towards one point of view or another. So they go back very happily. And news went back and forth as well. Quasi-official things like pamphlets and broadsheets, but also, letters, correspondence, that kind of thing, which would be read out. And that's how they kept up to date. Now, there were obviously problems with the system because of the distance. the first thing that comes to mind is the trial and execution of Charles I, because the weather over that winter seems to have been very bad. Very few ships made the crossing. And so, as far as I can recall, the colonies didn't know that the king was on trial until news reached them in spring, at which point it was, oh yeah, the king was on trial, he was found guilty, now he's dead, and don't you dare proclaim his son, because if you do, that's treason. And so that kind of hits everyone like a ton of bricks. And then as soon as it gets to one colony, it spreads very quickly, and they all have very different reactions to it. But yes, they are very, very connected until they can't be because of geography, weather, the limitations of 17th century shipping.
Yes, I think absolutely, I totally agree. Quite a few notable characters come back, don't they? So Hugh Peters comes back, and he stays. Harry Vane was a governor, I think, somewhere in the New England. Yeah. Oliver Cromwell writes to a lot of them, and Roger Williams comes over, and he has a really direct influence on English thought, and I think Cromwell's thought about toleration and all the rest of it. Because I think, isn't Roger Williams the Rhode Island bloke?
He is.
Maybe wrong, don't quote me on it.
Next question from Phil Pomerantz. He asks, I know that Cromwell invites the Jews back into England during the Commonwealth. I also know that there were still some Jews in England prior to that, despite Edward I's expulsion. What was life like in the first half of the 17th century in England for those Jews that were there before more were invited back?
No, look, I'm not an expert on this, and it was you that passed me the hospital ball, I think, wasn't it, Sam? Thanks for that. Thanks for that. And I must admit, I follow a chap called Dean Irwin, who's a real expert on Jews on Facebook. And if only Dean were here, I'm sure he'd know the answer. But I think the one-word answer is lies the word secretive. So I understand there were some Jews in Britain, many Marranos from Spain and Portugal. I think that means Jewish people who kind of pretended to converted, but probably haven't really. So, as in Spain, they often seem to have outwardly worshipped as Christians, but continued on their religious practices privately. Most were in London merchant communities. There are a few individual names that come down. A chap called George Ames, who was known to Henry VIII, and I think had a secret synagogue, lots of connections with Jews in Antwerp. But there was also persecution if they were found out, when there were no pogroms, but then that's because there are very few Jews and they're very secretive. So there is a community. I think there was a community of Marranos in Bristol. Rachel, actually, of this parish, made me aware of a book claiming the involvement of Marranos in Scotland, actually. I haven't read the book properly yet. But again, it's all very secret. It isn't done outwardly. So they began practicing their religion openly once it became possible after Cromwell, I think, eventually does it by ordinance, because when he proposes it to the council, everybody gets very cross, so he just does it without agreeing it with Parliament, which I suppose is called tyranny. Anyway, there you go. And services, I think, started a small synagogue in Church Lane in 1657, and that is all I know, Phil. Was there, asks Mark from Philly, was there a royalist path to victory in the Second War, or was it doomed as it seemed? If there hadn't been a second civil war, would Charles have kept his head? So sneakily, that's two questions.
Nothing's impossible. You never know what could have happened. It could have all turned around, but it would have required just incredible coordination between several different armies. You'd need former enemies to put aside very bloody differences that are going back, in some cases, generations. You'd need much better commanders than you had. Hamilton would have to be nowhere near any decision-making. And you'd need a massive dose of luck on top of that. So it was possible in that it was theoretically a possibility, but it wasn't, they weren't good odds. You wouldn't want to gamble and risk your life and several thousand other lives, which Charles decided he was going to do. If there hadn't been a second civil war, then probably, yes, Charles would have kept his head. Because if he hadn't compromised, it would have gone, I would guess, two different ways. Patience would have run out, either in Parliament or with the public. And so I can see two paths out of that stalemate. Either Parliament would have given into public pressure, for a settlement, any settlement. Just give the king what he wants. We want everything to go back to normal. And eventually that pressure may have won them over. Or Parliament's patience would run out with the king and they'd just depose him. They'd have stuck him in a comfortable but safely out of the way castle, and they'd replace him with a son under terms that they were happy with. I don't think that they would have considered killing him or a regicide without that second civil war. But so I think Charles absolutely signs. Well, he doesn't sign his death warrant, but he definitely opens up that door to, oh, well, maybe we don't just depose the guy. Maybe he's not worth that.
Although at Putney debates, the phrase "man of blood" gets used for the first time by Captain Bishop. Generally speaking, as I understand it, according to Ian Gentles, attitudes to the king were still very positive despite the war then. So I think you're right.
Yes, it comes up at the Putney debates. You covered it more recently than I did. Don't they throw people out when they start talking about regicide?
Yes, I think that's right. They're very against it, yeah.
So I think that's it. I think it's he tried again with the Second Civil War. He showed he was untrustworthy. He showed that he wasn't listening to God, and he really pissed off people. So Mary Stuart Berger has a few questions. She admits, I have several. The first one is, Charles plainly had a good deal of support. Why was it so badly coordinated and led, such as in the Second Civil War? Her second question is, can you outline the progression of and identify the tipping point from one officer calling Charles that man of blood to a critical mass of opinion that it was necessary to get rid of him? Third, can you explain the origin of the epithet man of blood? Did the theory of bodily humours play into that at all? Charles doesn't seem to fit the concept of a sanguine type, except in his unfounded self-confidence, i.e. he wasn't loud, cheery and ruddy-faced, and she says thank you.
Good question. Right, wonderful. So, number one, I had a good deal of sport. Why was he so badly coordinated and lose? Actually, to be honest, I don't think the Royalist cause was any more badly coordinated than Parliament's until the new model comes along. I think the new model makes a massive difference. It is very disconnected because Charles was a good tactical commander, actually, funnily enough, but not a good strategic commander. And he didn't like telling people what to do. So he suggests rather than ordering people, classically with Rupert, but actually he's not even good at telling the Duke of Newcastle to do things. So he never gets together a workable strategy which he pushes through, and nobody does, in fact, until Fairfax gets the new model. In the progression to man of blood, to a critical mass of opinion, I don't think it ever does get to a critical mass of opinion, actually, amongst the population. Mary, basically, it is the new model army that, and some other people in the general public, who kill the king. And that is because of the Second Civil War and the ignoring God's providence. I mean, that's very simplistic, but I think that's the case. Third was a great question, the man of blood thing. Well, it's Samuel's fault, isn't it? It's your fault, Sam.
It's from King James Bible, Numbers 35 to 33. So ye shall not pollute the land wherein ye are, for blood it defileth the land, and the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it.
Oh, it's Numbers, not Samuel.
It's mentioned twice. That's Numbers is the one that I was aware of, but there is Samuel 16:7-8.
Oh, good Lord.
And it's on about a bloody man and him being mischievous, but because he's a bloody man, which is...
I mean, to be fair, there's quite a lot in the blood in the Old Testament.
And the other thing I would say is that part of the problem, yes, leadership, especially in the Second Civil War, because Charles is in prison, and his main commander is Hamilton, who is just not a good commander. But there's so little in common in the Second Royalist Coalition. All they have in common is that they either want to defeat Parliament or restore the king. And those two usually overlap, but they don't even always overlap. But beyond that, they've got nothing. You've got deserters from the New Model Army in South Wales who have nothing in common with the Scots or the Irish. They just want to be paid. You've got other English rebels who are really annoyed with parliamentary rule a lot, mostly because of taxes. But those taxes go to pay the army, so they're not going to really link up. The Scots were divided amongst themselves. Half of them don't turn up to fight. And then Ireland's Ireland, and there's no putting that back in the box just for one little war. So they're all just so divided, and so it just lets the New Model Army just roll them up piece by piece.
So this is from somebody called Sam. Did you sneak in your own question?
I would never.
Sam asks, throughout the Civil Wars, there's a steady trickle of influential pro-parliamentarians switching over to the royalist side. Why doesn't it swing the balance of power back to royalists? And were there any instances of people switching the other way round? I think it doesn't swing the balance because it's, broadly speaking, individuals, and they have left, as they transfer, they leave their influence and money or a lot of it behind. So it's just never enough. They don't take a bit of the country with them, by and large. Holland actually does get involved in the Second Civil War, so in a way he does bring some back. But basically it's just individuals. I can't think of any high-profile names to go the other way, but throughout the Civil War and afterwards, there's an increasing number of royalists who are going through the sequestration and compounding process with the regime. So they say, right, I've given enough to the king here. I'm going to pay my fine and I'm going to get my lands back and I'm just going to keep my head down from now on. So for example, up here at Stoner Park near us, one of them goes for the king and gets killed in Basing House. The rest of them just keep their heads down.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head with the fact that if we're talking like big names, yeah, they're big names, but they're just individuals. I think a lot of it's momentum. Until the Restoration, people are defecting mostly over personal differences or personal ambitions or things going wrong or falling out of favour. They were leaving because things hadn't gone their way or that they weren't happy with the way the cause was going. But because Parliament was generally on the up, apart from a few points where Charles seems to grab it back, the momentum was already in their favour. A couple of people going over because they're throwing a tantrum isn't going to turn that back. And in terms of people switching the other way, Ireland has loads. There are plenty of people in Ireland who switch back and forth, and that is often due to local political concerns. Lord Inchiquin, for example, he defects from Parliament back to the Royalists, partly because his local rival was staying with Parliament, partly because he thought the king would be better for him and his estates. And then in Scotland you've got Montrose, who starts off as a Covenanter. Then, after the Solemn League and Covenant, he can't stand Argyll, and so he becomes Charles's most effective Scottish leader, even though MacColla did all the work.
Oh, that's a little harsh. He didn't do all the work.
He did the most important bits, and Montrose seemed to suffer a lot when MacColla's not there. That's all I'll say. The first question from Benjamin is, what do you think would have been the most likely outcome if the English Presbyterian politicians hadn't been so opposed to paying the army? Would the Solemn League and Covenant have held? Would there have eventually been a constitutional Stuart monarchy encompassing the three kingdoms and the Netherlands, or do you think something else would be more likely?
I think if they had paid the army, that would have been the end of it. I think the army would have been largely disbanded, or a lot of it would, or enough left to go and do Ireland. There would have been no Scottish war, because why would there have been? So I think that would have been the end of it if they'd paid him. Denzil Hollis has got a lot to answer for. And incidentally, actually, Hutton's view is that in time Christmas, which of course had already been banned well before Cromwell gets into power, that in time Christmas would indeed have disappeared in England, as it already had done so in Scotland. So yes, then, to a constitutional monarchy, although of course we already had a constitutional monarchy. But the other question about Netherlands, no way would the Netherlands ever have said, oh yes, we want to be united with England. I mean, they were the richest, most prosperous country in Europe at the time, with complete dominance of the VOC in Asia of the spice trade. I mean, that was always an odd idea. That's my answer. What do you think?
I completely agree that if the army had been paid off, then things will look very, very different. And I think, yeah, there would be a strong settlement after that. With the Netherlands, I also agree, not a hope in hell. It always strikes me as so bizarre that there is this belief that, oh yeah, no, of course they'll want to join us. Why wouldn't they want to join us? Because they're Protestants like us. And then they just say, no, we're not. We are certainly not. It's so bizarre because the English are so full of praise for the Dutch struggle against the Spanish, for their independence, for their freedom, for their autonomy. And then they go, well, of course, they've done all that. They've fought a war for 80 years. Of course they want to immediately join their larger neighbour. Why wouldn't they want to do that? But that ignores like the internal politics of the United Provinces, because they're not a single state. They're a union of multiple different states. And it's like, okay, cool. So are all of those states going to be equal partners of a Britannic union? Probably not. It's such a weird non-starter, and I'm not super surprised that some of the biggest advocates for it were fifth monarchists, who thought that Jesus was right around the corner and he really wanted all his Protestants to be allies.
Okay, so we agree on that. So this is the last one. We both get to answer this, don't we? What is your personal favourite what-if question from the Wars of Three Kingdoms? Great place to end. Well done, us. And what do you think the most likely alternative scenario would be?
My what-if is, what if Parliament had put Prince Henry on the throne? I think that changes a lot of things. I think it is, as in either right after the Second Civil War, before the trial of his dad, or perhaps even afterwards, in the days afterwards. I think that establishes a really strong constitutional monarchy 50 plus years before 1688. Wait, no, that's not 50 plus. I can't do maths.
You're a historian. How?
I think it would split the royalist cause massively. Okay, you support the House of Stuart. Well, there's a king of the House of Stuart on the throne.
It's quite interesting.
What do you do then? Like, who do you support? Do you support who you consider as the rightful king, or do you support the king who's there? That's less effort, that's less risk. And I think because Henry was so young, Parliament could raise the king, they could ensure he was Protestant, which they did anyway with Henry. It causes a bit of trouble with his Catholic mother when he goes to join her. And it really gives Parliament some time to entrench the new order before Henry reaches his majority and starts actually trying to throw his weight around. So that would be it. I would say the biggest what if is, what if they put Henry on the throne? What about you?
That is a nice one. Although, of course, Henry had promised his dad that he would be torn in pieces before allowing that to happen.
He did promise that, but at the same time he was an 8-year-old kid, so he doesn't really get a say.
I've got loads. First what if is what would have happened if Henry Stuart had not died, Charles's brother.
Oh, yes.
We had a different king. It's ifs, buts and maybes, because, of course, he might have changed and turned into an idiot like Charles. But, the way it was looking, he was much more Protestant than Charles. He was much more robust. He was very popular. So we might just never have had the Wars of Three Kingdoms, that he managed what was a tricky but entirely manageable situation better, and we'd never had it. We'd just have a more constitutional monarchy in the line of John Selden and whatever.
I think that's a really good one, because I think, Henry gets a lot of praise because he's lucky to die young. But we don't know what he would be like as a king. But it did occur to me then that he is, how much older than he is he from Charles? That's how much time that his dad could train him.
Yes, and he's been born to kingship,
Yes, he's been raised to it. Speaking of, psychoanalyzing Charles, I think that is something that comes up quite a bit, is that Charles was not expecting to be king. He wasn't mentally prepared for it, perhaps.
Yeah, he'd have made a very good art collector, wouldn't he? or maybe even a bishop,
That's the other thing that always comes up, is that, stick him in Canterbury, he'll be happy.
Yes.
And he probably would have been.
Probably would have been, yeah. What if Cromwell and Lambert had not won at Dunbar, which they really shouldn't have done, to be honest? What would have happened then? Not actually have been that much different, to be honest, because over time, England have so much more resource than Scotland. But God's providence,
Yeah, it would. I mean, Cromwell was shattered after the Western design failed. But then again, it wasn't like he was in a great position at Dunbar and a defeat was unexpected. It was the opposite. That was why it was the miracle of Dunbar.
Yeah.
Maybe if it was just a defeat, then
it's
like, okay, fine,
again,
we retreat back.
Yeah, it might have been.
It depends on if it breaks the political will in England, or at least makes them hesitate or want to try and have some kind of negotiation.
It's probably unlikely, isn't it? So it's probably a bit of a rubbish what if that. So what if the Westminster Assembly had not been so heavily influenced by the need of the Scottish alliance and therefore the Covenanters? Austrian Woolrich raises this one, that he reckons it might well have been that they would have had a much more tolerant, broad consensus that came out, which melded the different English elements together. But because they had to have the Scots, and because there was a significant English Presbyterian group there, it goes all the way to the Solemn League and Covenant, which even people like Cromwell, he signed it, but I don't think he ever really believed in it. So maybe we would have had a more equitable religious settlement.
It would have massive repercussions. And I think you're right. I think the weighting, the Scots putting their finger on the scales of the Westminster Assembly is so important to the way the settlement comes out, because it's so heavily Presbyterian. And I think you're right. I think that the natural inclination of Parliament before the Scots are so necessary is is probably closer to independency more than Presbyterianism, or at the very least a very mild Presbyterianism. Because, the pushback against the Laudian reforms, sure, most people agreed with that. And I think you'd get a much milder settlement that would probably have been way more appealing to a lot of people.
So what if Henry Cromwell had succeeded Oliver?
See, this is a good one, because I think it would have changed a lot of things. I think, obviously, neither of us have got to that point yet, so I haven't looked at it in super detail. But Henry seems like a much more effective character than his older brother.
But then on the other hand, it's not clear that Oliver actually chose anybody, because he was pretty much dead by the time they came in and he raised a finger or something. So it's not even clear that he chose Richard. It's interesting. I mean, he had a very difficult situation, that's got to be said, Henry, at that time. The army was up in arms, but he had experience of ruling in Ireland. He had demonstrated he was effective.
Henry also did have his enemies in Ireland with the army. He was basically brought in to kick out Charles Fleetwood, because Fleetwood was being a maniac, being a hardcore, like, oh no, purge all the Irish, not just the landowners. Yeah, it would be interesting. I think he would have had to face down the army. I think he probably would have tried to in a way that Richard didn't. And whether he was successful, whether it would last, I don't know, but I think it would have been way more interesting. Possibly another civil war, thinking about it.
What if Lambert had defeated Monk as Monk came south with his army?
I'm not actually sure. I think it wouldn't be a restoration. I think Lambert was too ambitious, too canny, and, this was his baby. The Protectorate was his baby.
I think you might have had the best possible outcome. You might have had an English republic. Lambert was utterly involved with that. That was the way he thought it should be, though with a monarchical element, as it were. If he'd defeated Monk, the army would have been ruling again, but Lambert obviously wanted to get it towards a constitutional angle, so I don't know. I think it might have been the best possible outcome.
Yeah, it would have been a better end for Lambert himself, certainly. Well, thank you, everyone who has sent in questions. This has been a lot of fun. We've really enjoyed it. If we didn't enjoy it, it wouldn't have taken however many episodes this comes out as.
I mean, Sam, to be honest, I think quite probably we've enjoyed this good deal more than the listeners are going to enjoy it.
No, I'm sure that's not the case.
I've got to be honest.
I'm sure that's not the case. I'm sure they're all gripped to our bickering. And
you really think so? Well, you can tell us, everyone. Tell us. Should we never do this again, or was whatever?
If you don't already listen to David's show, it's The History of England on all good podcast apps. It's absolutely incredible. You really are missing out if you don't already listen.
I might also say, if you're not listening to Sam's podcast already, you've made absolutely the right decision. Sam's podcast already, Pax Britannica, it is fantastic. Sam, far more professional and historical than me. He's got some great interviews with loads of people. It's really good, and it's funny too. So, Pax Britannica, go make a beeline for it.